Biden seems to be taking the fact that the For the People Act was filibustered really in stride. He doesn't seem that worried about it. Doesn't really seem like many politicians are that worried about it. I wish that they were a little bit more worried about it. That said, there are some things that are coming up having to do with voting rights that I think we should throw into the mix. I understand that all of this is going to be going on during the backdrop of maybe they do something about the For the People Act, maybe they don't. So we know baked into the situation since January in Georgia, Florida, Iowa, Arkansas, and Montana, they've already passed and signed new bills to make voting more difficult in a ton of different insidious ways. Dozens of additional efforts are pending. As Charles pointed out, the Justice Department announced last Friday that it was filing a major voting rights case challenging a sweeping new voting law in Georgia, one of the biggest voting cases the department has filed in recent years. So far it's only challenging that one. Now, really fast, Charles, what are your hopes or expectations for that case? Considering the Supreme Court that we have, how hopeful are you that anything they challenge wouldn't just be upheld by the Supreme Court anyway?
Well, here's the thing, John. I mean, a lot of what we're seeing in terms of state legislatures, this is the progeny of Shelby versus Holder. And I can't believe it's been like 15 years since Shelby. This is Shelby versus Holder was a Supreme Court case, or the Supreme Court case during the Obama administration that essentially set the stage to gut the Voting Rights Act and set the stage for all of these pieces of legislation to actually exist. Now, when that decision was written, Justice Roberts essentially said that the restrictions that were created by the Voting Rights Act weren't longer any necessary because the vestiges of discrimination that existed in America that created the need for that no longer existed. I think what we are seeing now certainly speaks differently to that. And so if he's consistent, which the court is supposed to do, and he re-examines his logic there and sees what we're seeing across the country, perhaps he may look at, the entire court for that matter, may re-examine it in a way that says, you know what, maybe we jumped the gun on this whole post-racial idea, and it's time to sort of allow for us to revisit the Voting Rights Act, but specifically strike down this Georgia law as being unconstitutional. And what that does is it blows the door open for a number of other challenges in state houses across the country. That may or may not happen. What I will say, because sometimes the court, wants to prove itself right. What I will say about that is that the Supreme Court is not last because it's right. It's right because it's last.
Yeah. That potential future you sketched out sounds good. We'll have to see. We'll have to see. Yeah, and it is crazy. It's been 15 years, huh? Yeah. Well, the Supreme Court's gonna get involved in some other ways as well. We have this case Brnovich versus the Democratic National Committee that they could potentially rule on, I suppose, any day by the end of the session. Deals with two different issues. First, Arizona's out of precinct policy, which discards ballots cast outside of the voter's designated precinct. Does it violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act? The other part is, does Arizona's ballot collection law, which forbids anyone other than the voter, him or herself, from handling a completed early ballot, violate the same section of the VRA or the 15th Amendment? According to SCOTUS blog, during oral arguments back in March, it seemed like a majority of the justices were ready to uphold both of those provisions. So if anyone else helped you with your ballot, it could be discarded. If you happened to be in the wrong precinct, even though you're totally allowed to vote, no one questions that, no one believes it was tampered with, anything. It's just, oops, you got confused by this really confusing system, so we're gonna discard your ballot. And I think you can guess what sort of class of people are more likely to be hit by that than others. So apparently, Charles, the SCOTUS is willing to. It's looking like they're willing to uphold both of those. Is that your guess, and how significant would that be? Does that make you think differently potentially about the Georgia situation we were just talking about?
It does, and I find it to be troubling. I mean, I think that ultimately, I'm not entirely convinced that they are going to hold it up. If I had to look at the composition of the court, I'm not as confident as I would like to be, but I'm not immediately deterred. This court, surprisingly enough, has proven itself slightly more moderate than I expected. It's stacked with conservatives, but ultimately a lot of the decisions that have come out have not been as staunchly conservative as I would have expected given their makeup. That leaves me with a scintilla of hope, John. It's not necessarily like this huge ray of light that I'm expecting to see, but what could happen is a decision that doesn't necessarily talk as tough as conservatives that might like, and then ultimately muddies the waters for lawyers because it may provide room on both sides for further argument. That being said, because they may see an issue that is ripe or on the horizon, but punt on it because it's not the issue that was squarely put before the court. That being said, in terms of the implications that it could have on the Georgia case, it could be a very serious hurdle or a sort of I'll say message or sort of reading the tea leaves, if you will, around how they intend to approach the Georgia case in terms of their rationale and what they're looking for. Nevertheless, what I will also comment on is that this entire cloud of resistance to further engagement of the civic process on behalf of voters has really grown and been fertilized by a huge misinformation campaign. And I think it goes without saying, a lot of people may not, may take this for granted, but I do have to point out to the viewers that a lot of what is happening from the court of public opinion, switching gears for that matter, is the result of people not actually understanding that while these laws may seem facially neutral and while it may seem like a good thing to protect the integrity of democracy, you are ultimately trying to, with these laws, solve for a problem that does not actually exist. And I think that the misinformation that has been put out and promulgated by so many different people on so many different levels, media included at some point, has created the idea that there is such an urgent need to stop so many people from cheating and winning and taking elections and all this other crap that hasn't actually happened. But people don't understand that. And so even in conservative districts, if they're not well informed or they haven't bothered to get media from and information from a variety of sources, they legitimately think Black and brown people are out here stuffing ballot boxes with names of dead people and stealing elections.
Yeah.
And so this legislation, like, this is the right thing to do. And at the end of the day, no one or very few people are talking about the fact that this widespread notion of voter fraud is a farce and it's based on nothing more than a bunch of lies. And I think reframing that narrative would go a very long way in getting people to understand how, not only how unnecessary these laws are, but then when you go and take a step further and you think about who's pushing these laws, because those people who are pushing these laws are very much so informed that these aren't real problems. Then the question becomes, well, then if they're not trying to solve that, what are they trying to do?
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So
there's a couple of different ways that you can potentially win elections, a couple of different ways you can potentially get into power. They're choosing one rather than the other, I think.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.